It may come as no surprise to any familiar with the world of psychic phenomenon that the powers and abilities of such gifted individuals function in a mental state that is very often akin to hallucination. A psychic of great ability can spend a subsequently inordinate amount of their lifetime doubting their every perception and reaction. Thus, the period of awakening is a transitional stage in the psychic's development, where the individual must come to terms with whatever processes their mind may be attempting to relay. It is vital to the psychic's development that he or she accepts that reality is subjective, and nature is intricately linked and transposed to their very force of will. Chapter 11. The Book of the Skull. Night had fallen, and the darkness was settling over the city as the car slowed to the curve and the back door opened. The old man got out, and passing off the concerns of his colleagues with a wave of his hand, he approached the doors of the club, autumn leaves rustling at his feet. The nightly crowd had already begun to gather at the doors, but as the gentleman approached, he closed his eyes for a moment, and the gathered throng began dispersing in mass. Soon, only the tall, thin old man stood before the bouncer at the door, who seemed confused as he searched his clipboard of names. "My name is on the list," the old man said in a thick German accent. "Why, yes, it is," the bouncer said, smiling behind his dark sunglasses, and unhooked the red rope, allowing the man entrance. The man entered and stood at the top of a large overhang which overlooked the main floor, remembering possibly the worst night of his life with vivid clarity. Now he looked upon the elegance and grandeur of the place with revulsion, as he studied the patrons who meandered about like sheep grazing in a pasture. He closed his eyes once more, and the sheep began wandering confusedly before hurriedly rushing to the doors, brushing past the old man as if herded by some unseen shepherd. The only people remaining sat at a large booth at the rear of the dance floor, at precisely the same table where the old man and his group had laughed merrily on the 1st of October. The old man, stooped and weary, made his way down the stairs and crossed the room before approaching the table and standing silently before the well-dressed man and his two female companions and two large suited bouncers with slick black hair and sunglasses. From the way they were sitting in the position of their hands resting on the sides of their coats, it was obvious they carried weapons and were expecting trouble. "Mr. Abendroth," Peter Agrand said with a false smile which barely masked his hostility, "perhaps you can tell me why you have ruined my business for the day." Diedrich studied the group before him and noticed the many gold rings worn by all, and he was reassured as to why they were not currently killing each other as his psychic impulse was commanding. The discovery of the blocking charms was one more piece to the mystery added to the growing picture of how the events of the tragic night had transpired. He noted that the rings were shaped like coiled serpents, and filed away the information as he began to speak. "I have come only as a preliminary warning. See Erkenhoften Maiden." His words were even and unemotional as he moved to the side, away from the center view of the table from the door. "This will be your one opportunity to confess in detail the full extent of your involvement with Angel's death. You will give me names, dates, and locations, or else this information will be extracted by much more unpleasant means. If you cooperate, you may even live. but I give you no promise of that. However, if your information proves helpful, you will at least die quietly. The 5 men began laughing as the 2 girls gazed at the old man with pity. Mr. Abendroth, I have no intention of wasting any of my time speaking to the likes of you. I am very sorry for your loss, but Angelica Love was a stupid whore who got what she deserved as far as I am concerned. The others of the group were laughing like high school children amused by the abuse of an unpopular classmate. That is a definite no then, I take it. Well, I would suggest that you let these 2 giggling morons go before my questioning continues. Once more the laughter grew louder as the 2 women puffed up indignantly. There will be no further questions, Mr. Abendroth. You are leaving. Very well. Diedrich closed his eyes once more as the door of the club was incinerated in flames, and bullets guided by telekinetic control flew through the club and found their mark in the heads of Peter Agrand's retinue. Peter watched in shock as a searing flame issued from the holes in the heads of the 4 corpses now slumped beside him at the table. As Peter started to climb over the table in terror, he was met by an invisible wall of force, which pressed him back down between the dead women. They were all wearing blocking charms, Diedrich announced as he removed his pipe casually from his inner coat pocket. Damn it! Ryan replied as he, Jesse, and Cho entered through the charred doorway, a lit propane torch in Jesse's hand. How could we have not noticed? Because we were being drugged from the moment we entered, Cho answered as he walked to the booth, his eyes black and filled with rage. Who would even have access to stuff like that? As Jesse spoke, the flame from the torch dwindled, only to reappear, outlining the fingers of his free hand in a blue glow. The same person who would have access to an antique spellbook, I suspect, Diedrich answered, puffing thoughtfully from the dragon's tail. So, how about you enlighten us, Mr. Agrand? You are, I am afraid, quickly running out of time. I can't tell you anything, Peter replied, his face twisted with panic and body still frozen. This person, he can do things that aren't real, man. Peter's voice had slipped into its natural Chicago accent as he stared pleading at his captors. Well, then I guess we're just going to have to get unreal on your ass, Ryan said with a savage grin as Cho removed a long gleaming knife from within his suit coat. Peter watched in disbelief as the bald Asian man leaned over the table and, grabbing his hand, held it down on the tabletop. The rings gleamed in the light which shone from the ceiling over the table as the blade crashed down, and his entire appendage was severed with the expert, smooth stroke of a trained butcher. The scream which left the producer's wide, straining mouth brought sick and vengeful pleasure to the 4 men. With the ring gone, Peter's mind fell under Diedrich's influence with ease as he began speaking. His name is Andrew Love, and he's Angelica's uncle. He's a crime boss living in Amsterdam, and he's got people everywhere. He's got power like nothing you've ever seen, and he's got something planned for Halloween. He wanted Angel and all her people out of commission, and he paid me to supply information. What did he pay you? Jesse said as all the hurt rage he had felt for days built in his chest like a bolt of lightning ready to burst from a cloud. Money, drugs, lots of little trinkets like the rings, but I couldn't have said no if I wanted to. He's got these kids running around like zombies. They were the ones who killed Angel. They were convinced she was a vampire or something. A vampire, Ryan said, confused. It's the game. Samhain. It's like mind control, man. Those kids are all doped up and lost in some fantasy where Angel was a vampire lord. They thought they were saving the world or something. When you guys killed the Shadow Walker, he went from plan B. I think the Shadow Walker was supposed to kill Angel first, but for some reason, he wouldn't do it. And that was when he contacted me, and he offered me... Peter was resisting Dietrich's influence, but with a nod, the German forced him to continue. He offered me slaves. After his big plan went over, he said I could have the whole Northeast as my reward. What is he going to do on Halloween? Jesse whispered with a growing feeling of ominous paranoia. He's going to take it all down. Everything. He's got someone else helping him too, but I never heard their name mentioned. This guy, he's all about snakes, man. All the stuff he gave me has something on it with a snake. This guy looks like a snake. I just wanted her to pay. She ruined everything. That show was the highest paying franchise in television history, and she walked away and shit on it. The last few sentences had been too much for Jesse to bear, and before he even knew what he was doing, he had launched a ball of blue fire from his hands onto the captive producer. Peter screamed as the entire explosive force contained within the propane torch exploded in an eruption of flames. They stood and watched with cold satisfaction. Ryan still holding the writhing form down by will until the flames spread to the walls. And they left Club Estrange, a blazing furnace on the downtown side of the street. The real question is, how much of what Gran said do we actually believe? Dietrich was pacing a wide circle around the table with clouds of smoke billowing from his pipe like a coal-driven locomotive. The guild room was filled with the remainders of its leading members, Cho, Ryan, and Jesse standing at the front of the assembly, which had been called to decide the fate of Angel's organization and matters brought to light by the interrogation of the late Peter Agrand. He could not have lied under your influence, Marcella Duval stated over her shoulder as Dietrich passed behind her. I believe that we must take it all with the uttermost seriousness. It is true what you said of the Samhain clubs, especially in Europe, where I have seen them for myself. My friends in the FBI have assured me that the game's popularity is as widespread here in the United States on an underground level. Investigations into game-related crimes have been going on disguised from the media for at least 2 years. I am told that the current administration is desperately attempting to hide the fact that they have virtually no idea how to control the widespread influence of something as ridiculous as an online game. Apparently, it has been a fairly easy cover-up since the public is reluctant to accept that a game might be as dangerous an influence over people as the drug associated with it. And no one has any idea who is behind it, Jared Silverman, the automatic writer, questioned, as his hand absently traced figure eights on a large sketch pad before him. Well, if we are to assume that Angel did have an uncle, and he was privy to some version of the same kind of power that she herself commanded, then it would make sense that he might be considered as a likely source for a game. Dietrich gestured to Jesse, who seated himself and began tapping away at the keys of his laptop. A screen began lowering from the ceiling behind them as Jesse prepared the presentation, his laptop screen appearing projected above them. The first picture was of a collection of shabby houses and trailers situated beneath the heavy limbs of what looked to be a bayou. This is the town of Mossboro, Mississippi, which in essence was the hometown of Angelica Love. It has a population of some 2,000 people, and nothing of interest to the outside world except a gas station, a grocery store, and a small library. Angel never went to this town. These are pictures sent to her by a lawyer who oversaw her inheritance of a family estate in this area when she was only 21. As many of you know, she was researching her adoption in an attempt to find her biological family when she discovered that there was an estate left to her by her birth mother. This is that estate. The next photo was taken of a large house sunken in the mire of a swamp, buried in algae and debris. This was taken from atop a wall which ran the perimeter of the land, as any closer inspection would require the use of a boat. The estate was flooded sometime in the mid-80s and has since sat seen here for decades. What Angelica learned was that the family who had built and resided in the house was an eccentric group of European immigrants who had died out sometime in the 70s, leaving only Angel's mother as an eventual heir. How and why they died was a mystery subject to local speculation, and it is only known that the patron of the family was known to be involved in numerous illegal activities, whose death was rumored to be the retribution of failed unsavory business dealings. Public records hold that Angel's mother had at least 4 older siblings who, like her, but for the exception of the oldest, were distributed accordingly by the Mississippi Family Services. Angel's mother was brought back in the custody of her older brother, whose fate is unknown. Angel told me on the one and only occasion of which she spoke on this matter that she had searched for the other lost 2, but could find nothing of them, as their records had been lost in a fire years before she ever knew of their existence. I believe that it is plausible for us to assume that at least one of them is surviving, and that he is Andrew Love, of which we are now dealing. But why would he want to kill Angel? Deborah Jarvis, who headed the New Mexico healing facility, questioned. Diedrich once more gestured to Jesse, and the slide changed to a close-up of a golden serpent-fanged ring. This is one of the blocking charms used by Peter Legrand to avoid detection by our abilities. This and other items like it were distributed liberally amongst his entourage, and all of them show the likeness of snakes. Based on this, and the information we have acquired from the grimoire given to Harris Levine, we are to assume that this man, if he can be called that, is trafficking in extremely malignant energies, which would be at odds with those used by Angel herself. We believe that he feared Angel might be capable of disrupting whatever plans he had devised. So, what do you propose as our next course of action? Marcella's tone verged on sarcastic, and Diedrich reminded himself that she was one of the few true mind readers in the group, and could undoubtedly sense the confusion that he, Ryan, and Jesse were wallowing in, even as he explained. As I am sure you have already guessed, Frau Duval, that there is more. The next image to take the screen was a direct feed to Angel's personal website. The group watched with whispered questions as Jesse clicked on a series of messages posted by Angel beginning a year previous, soon after her acquisition of the Book of the Skull. These postings were brought to our attention when Jesse entered Angel's website in order to speak to and reassure Angel's followers in their time of distress. What he found was that Angel herself had been doing just that for at least 14 months. She knew it was going to happen, Marcella said as her face became pale and her eyes rimmed with tears. We knew that Angel had been claiming to see an apparition, which she referred to as the skull, and she believed it to be the very entity which was claimed to have authored the book. Here In her letters to her friends, she alludes to the entity without ever fully explaining the occurrences in question. We believe now that she was anticipating the attempts on her life, and even though had every intention of surviving, was also preparing, as it were, for the worst. Now, I am sure that all of you know that the healing centers have all been equipped with emergency disaster stations for use during floods, earthquakes, and other natural disasters. Here, in these messages, Angel more than hints at a catastrophe is coming, and that victims can find aid at her clinics. Here's where I confess my ignorance. I ask you, what you know of these stations? Deborah Jarvis brushed a tangled, stray mass of long gray hair from her face and gazed up at the group through enormous, thick, round glasses. They're compounds set up at every clinic. We all know that. But how big are they? Joe said, as he began to listen to the future echo with increasing, curious fascination. They're huge, Deborah stated, as if it were common knowledge. Hell, ours has been under construction since the clinic opened. Don't you remember the damn lawsuits that the Navajo launched against us in New Mexico? She had the damn contractors building right up against the plateau off of the Dark Canyon Reservation. They thought she was building a resort on their sacred ground, more like a goddamn bomb shelter. Half of it was an underground warehouse, stored canned and freeze-dried food, massive indoor growing facilities. The compounds are meant to be completely self-sufficient for decades. Well, Angel told me that she got the plans from NASA. Mitchell Cleft, the overseer of the Florida clinic, said, gripping his husband, Dr. Willis's Cord's hand for confirmation. She said that they were based on the blueprints that NASA used for the Mars colony, Dr. Cord clarified. They even have oxygen supplies and fuel reserves. She told us back in January that they would even have running water and electricity for years after any outside sources were gone. Jesse, didn't she have you running tech support for the clinics? Yeah, I knew she wanted all the stations connected by a wired network apart from the internet, but I didn't know why. So all of these places would still have computers, even if the internet went down, Joe said with awe in his voice as he contemplated the sheer magnitude of what Angel had been working on. In theory, the whole country would still be connected, communication-wise, even if there was no other infrastructure to support it. The Guild now has an internet within itself, complete with a massive archive of stored data. Jesse sat staring at the computer screen as he contemplated the implications of what they were discussing. What about Europe and Asia? Joe asked as he noticed several of the responses to Angel's postings were international. There are clinics in almost every country in the world, but communication between each one would last transoceanic only until the last of the orbiting communication satellites gave out. But they could last for years, since the clinics were broadcasting on private signals. Good Lord in heaven, she was preparing for the apocalypse, Deborah said with wonder over the hushed room. And she wanted us to try and stop it, Joe said, as he walked through the crowd and left the room. Where's he going? Marcella asked Dietrich. He is scheduled for a flight to Amsterdam, and so am I. The questions and debates began as Dietrich followed Joe, leaving Jesse and Ryan to explain the remainder of their current plans to ready the emergency compounds for whatever may occur. Joe was slumped in the large, comfortable seat as the by now familiar fever rose. His body and mind ached in an ongoing agony. Strange, dreamlike images emerged, as if from an ocean in his thoughts, only to blur and disperse before solidifying into clarity. Diedrich sat across from him, watching with interest as sweat poured from his partner's brow. "So, are you going to resist it at this time?" he asked casually as he withdrew his phone from his pocket and began loading an image sent from Jesse's laptop. "No, not this time. I accept it for whatever it is," Joe said as he fought the urge to vomit. "It has always struck me as fascinating that the transition so resembles radiation poisoning. Have you been through it?" "Oh, yes. When I was in my 40s, I was working a missing persons case in Berlin. I had been a heavy drinker for most of life up until that point. That case changed my life. That was when I first became aware of the forces which surround us and the people that can use them. You are very fortunate that you met Angel. There are those psychics who are seduced by the more malignant forces and become unspeakably evil in the process. During that time, I went through horrible withdrawal as well as the awakening. I remember Angel saying that she experienced hers while she was in junior high school. Drugs. I used drugs to suppress it. Yes, I believe that this happens quite often. Angelica said on many occasions that the number of gifted might be doubled or even tripled if it were not for the interference of substance repressing the onset of the transition. Here, look at this." Diedrich handed Cho the phone, and Cho stared weakly at the screen where he saw a sketch drawn of a man of indeterminate age with long black hair and large, frightening eyes. "After we left, Jared drew that sketch of the man whom we are searching. The text said that we are to look for someone with green eyes and a number of tattoos covering most of his body. Herr Silverman worked as a police sketch artist for many years, and I suspect that this is a very good likeness." Diedrich recovered his phone from Cho's shaking hands and returned it to his pocket. He sat for a moment in silence and thought of Angel once more as tears threatened to well in his eyes. How could someone who loved people as much as her be a victim of such horror? Cho said, as he caught vague whispers accidentally projected from the old German's mind. Such is the way of the world. There is day and there is night, following each other and destroying each other. However, even in the darkest hour there are stars shining, and the moon glowing, just as in the brightest day there are shadows, hiding in hidden places. When I returned from Washington, I had Jesse research 10 trees for me. His studies revealed that originally the town had been built 3 miles the west of where it sits now. In the 30s, it was but a few homes and stores sitting beside a lumber mill, which served as the town's main employer. There was also a butcher shop where a young man named Dalton Wicks owned a thriving business for many years. During the Depression, his business began to plummet, and I dare say that the man most likely lost his mind watching his family go hungry with the rest of the town. This man was no serial killer. A functioning psychopath, perhaps, but not fitting the profile of a killer deriving sexual pleasure from sadism or murder. I suspect that in his mind, he was simply solving a problem. The country was crawling with homeless and roaming vagabonds in search of work. Herr Wicks had already taken to hunting in the woods and selling the game when he could spare it. He would often travel the length of the railroad tracks, scouting for deer killed by the locomotive. At some point, he noticed the small camps of vagrants who would sit by the tracks as they used the empty cars to travel the country. At some point, he made the decision to kill another human being. In his mind, the line had separated killing an animal for food and killing another person. This was blurred to the point of no longer existing. He took the flesh of the homeless travelers, and not only did he feed himself, but he fed it to his family and sold it to the people of the town for any price that his neighbors could afford. He was a hero in the village, and because of him, people were fed and children did not starve. He saved the town of 10 trees. But if you think that these people would forgive him his evil when they learned the truth, you would be mistaken. After years of prosperity, he was discovered dragging the body of a wanderer into the back of his shop by a group of young boys playing in the woods. When the local sheriff entered the meat locker, he was greeted by the sight of 3 bodies suspended on meat hooks, ready to be processed by Hellwicks. The butcher was hanged in the woods and left to be eaten by the animals of the forest. The town was abandoned and would not be repopulated for another decade when the lumber mill reopened and trade returned to the area. The old town would be left to deteriorate until eventually it became a large city park. It was here that Harris Levine made his lair. I do not think that he knew of the dark history of the park, or that abandoned butcher shop had once been a place of horror. What I do think is that the entities using him were drawn to that place, since it was saturated in evil and madness. This is how I think that Angelica was choosing the sites for her clinics. Holy ground, Joe whispered, as he stared at Diedrich with dazed, feverish brown eyes. Yes, sacred places that might attract powerful entities charged with different energies than those used by our enemies. And if we want to find an individual like this Andrew Love, then we must look in a place that is awash in foul actions and memories. The plane had landed, and they were stepping out into the airport. The day was cool and cloudy as they found their way through the terminal. They had brought no luggage and had been making their way through the security checkout when Cho began to hear the gunshots. In his current state, it took him a few moments to realize that the shots were future echoes, but he was conscious enough to grab Diedrich by the sleeve and stop him before exiting the doors of the airport. Gunshots, Diedrich! Someone's going to open fire! Diedrich's eyes began erratically scanning the crowd, and it took only seconds for him to spot the darkly clad teenagers who were prowling in and out of the assorted groups of travelers. Unfortunately, just as he had identified them, he and Cho were themselves spotted. Diedrich threw Cho to the floor with a strength beyond his age as he rolled sideways behind a white pillar, errant gunshots slamming to the bodies of bystanders standing close to the true targets of the attack. Airport security leapt into action as the crowd fell into general chaos, running and diving in all directions as the pale, sickly gunman continued shooting blindly at everyone in sight. Diedrich peered out from behind the pillar and stared at the gunmen, 3 gothic punk-dressed boys, 2 similarly dressed girls, as they fired at every moving person. Concentrating, he sent one clear message to all 5. Throw down your weapons. As he had hoped, they were not in possession of any of the trinkets supplied to a Grant and his group, and immediately flung their weapons down before instantly being tackled by an army of security officers. Diedrich sighed, resting his hand on his arms, and before he heard Cho's voice from his side, Dieter, you're bleeding. Diedrich raised his head and smiled at the sweaty, feverish face that stared at him with lost and intrinsic sorrow. Yes, my friend, I have been shot in the chest, I believe. As he spoke, his words were followed by a rupture of blood pouring from his lips. Cho rolled him onto his back and held Dietrich's head in his arms as the red hemorrhage continued to pool on the cold, white tiles around them. The ancient German's eyes gazed off into space, and Cho began to weep as he grasped one long, leathery hand, as if desperate to hold on to the old man in his final moments. As the tears rolled down his face, he heard a coughing, guttural laugh issue from the dying man. I can see him, you know. After all this time, I finally see him. I think he has been here the whole time. Who, Dieter? Cho said, glancing up and seeing no one. The skull, mein Gott. I see it, floating. Right over there, by the windows, in a long purple shroud, just as Angelica described. He is like the Grim Reaper, is he not? Waiting there for me to die. And take me someplace, perhaps. Maybe to Angelica and my wife. It would be nice to see all my friends again. I have missed them so dearly. One last breath escaped his lips before he was gone, lying dead in Cho's arms. It was then that Cho did see something, as the spirit sickness peaked at the moment of his greatest sorrow. The airport had grown silent, as all of the sirens, shouts, and screams drift away like music carried into the distance on a breeze. All was dark as the storm began to rage outside, and the lights began to flash on and off in disconcerting strobe-like patterns. He was alone in a quiet place, and walking towards him from the shadows was a massive, dark shape, punctuated by two gleaming eyes of wondrous gold. Cho was not frightened, as the padded paws of the giant black tiger carefully fell softly and with powerful grace across the floor. It lay down at Dietrich's lifeless feet and stared at Cho with quiet dignity. Within his mind, all the turmoil and suffering was calmed, as a low female voice spoke with soothing and loving tones. Will you accept me now? Yes, he replied with his thoughts. Will you serve me? The voice said, forgiving him of his lifelong denial. Yes, as I should have been all along. Will you share your body, soul, and mind with me? I will. Good. Then I will give you my peace. Cho fell back, still holding on to his friend, as all of his emotions and rage were one by one unbound and freed to mix with the warm, coursing energy of the animal. And for the first time in his life, he was allowed to experience joy. These were the gifts of the tiger: power and eternity. We must go now. The voice summoned him from his euphoria. You may leave, and they will not see you. You have had this gift throughout your life, and have used it in ignorance. As long as you walk here in the darkness, you are only a shadow to them. Like The Shadow Walker, he asked, as he walked through the faded reality, which to his eyes seemed like an aged photograph. No, the one of which you speak was sinking into the blackness of dark spheres, where he was tainted and polluted by the energies contained therein. You are traveling in my sphere, which coexists side by side with the one from whence you were born. You are in between. Will you help me find Andrew Love and stop him? He was walking through the doors of the airport and into a day which he saw in a premature twilight. People passed by him as translucent shades unaware of his presence, the tiger walking stoically at his side. I will try to help you stop the Naga, but even the skull fears it may be too late. The Naga, Joe said, meeting the golden stare of the animal spirit. This person whom you seek is not of this sphere, as you are marked by the trace of my energies. He is a being almost completely of another world. This creature is almost as much serpent as man, and his will is twisted and corrupt by the influence of his own blood. He cares not for the fate of this sphere or any other. The skull has said that this world is doomed to fall into darkness, and that all we may do is endure these events. You have always seen the future. You may gaze further now, if you wish, for fate is set to unfold. Cho did as the tiger bade, and let his mind search and delve farther than he had ever dared let it seek. He could see the street before him and watched as the present melted into a chaos of destruction and horror. First, there were blood-curdling screams, not of one, but many, as people fled for their lives from the cannibal dead. He saw fires, explosions, gunshots, and anarchy before the city eventually was swallowed in rising water. Then what can we do? Your friend was correct. There is another place waiting. But the choice is yours as to how to end your time here. I would see this snake that has played at being a man. Then so be it. Walk far from here, then return to the lighted sphere, and we will find him. But you must know that you go to your death. So be it. Cho did not speak Dutch and could only discern a rare few words being shouted by the ranting man who stood outside the club on the street, harassing passers-by. He leaned forward and asked the cab driver what the man was saying after they had arrived on the corner of the block where Club Serpent was located. The American driver smiled and replied, "That nutcase is here every night trying to scare people off. He's saying that the city is infested with snakes and that ruin lies ahead. Poor idiot. I heard his girlfriend took up with the club owner about a year ago. I really feel sorry for the guy, man. You want to talk about a bad element? That club is packed with them. All the kids, they love that game. So they have the game in there. There are clubs all over the city, but knuckle slang, that's the most popular. Hell, there's almost as many support groups for game rehabilitation now as there are clubs. You mean there are people who quit the game? People who quit the game and the drug. Where do these groups meet? Well, the biggest is in a Catholic church a few miles from here. They meet like 3 nights a week and try to keep each other away from places like this. Joe stared at the small doorway in the side of what appeared to be an old warehouse where the flashing green neon sign flashed intermittently over the heads of those waiting to enter, wondering if there was not something else he might do besides enter and begin shooting. I will give you $300 American to take me to one of these meetings and translate for me. I can do that. Let me see the cash. Joe reached in his coat and withdrew a money clip from which he removed 3 bills before placing them in the waiting hand of the driver. The driver carefully folded the bills into the front pocket of his red flannel shirt and put the car back in the drive. You have a problem with substance abuse and gaming, sir? The driver said, eyeing Joe in the rearview. My whole life, and I'm really tired of it. It's about time I help out some others. Joe and the driver, named Will Marion, stood at the doorway at the bottom of the stairs as people filed past them to enter the large basement room filled with fold-out chairs arranged in a circle. There was a large chalkboard on which was written in straight, even letters each side of the 12 steps in defeating addiction, the first of which was, 1. Admit you have a problem. It was obvious to Joe that these people did indeed have a problem, and it was bigger than they would ever guess. A young priest was presiding over the group, greeting the members as they entered and poured coffee from an enormous percolator into small white styrofoam cups. There was a long table set with cupcakes, cookies, and other assorted sweets often craved by recovering addicts. Joe had already begun edging his way towards the table and lustily eyeing a large platter of home-baked strudels. The people of the group were obviously familiar with each other, and the room was filled with a pleasant, warm aura of compassion and empathy. Joe and his companion were noticed, but no one prodded them with questions or demanded information concerning their presence. There were at least 3 Asians in the group, Chinese, who nodded to Joe politely, and he returned their greeting with a smile and slight wave. The priest approached him and asked in English what language he spoke. When he answered in English, the priest shuffled through a handful of pamphlets before presenting him with one. Joe regarded it with curiosity as he read the title, heading, Addiction is not a game. Samhain and drug addiction learn the facts. The first page on the interior fold was a questionnaire. 1. Do you play Samhain more than 1 hour each day? 2. Do you disregard responsibilities and personal hygiene in order to play Samhain? 3. Have you lost jobs and relationships because you play Samhain? 4. Have you indulged in drug use, Samhain cocktail, while playing the game? 5. Have you ever felt compelled to act out by events in the game? 6. Have you ever suffered hallucinations or paranoia while not playing the game? 7. Do you feel that the game controls you? 8. Have you ever tried to quit playing Samhain and not been able to? 9. Have you ever felt that the game is more real than your life? And 10. Do you ever experience a loss of reality or disorientation when not playing the game? If you have answered yes to any of these questions, you may want to seek help. If so, the Sacred Reach program is here for you. There are people who understand. Joe looked around the room and realized that he and Will were the only ones left standing. They found 2 chairs in the back of the room and set apart from the circle. This did draw a few irritated looks from 1 or 2 group members, but the consensus still did not seem to mind their sitting in on the following discussion. Joe leaned over and listened carefully as Will summarized what was being said in order to keep up with the flow of conversation. The meeting began with a welcome from the priest who identified himself as Father Christophorus Andres. The father then asked if anyone had anything of interest that they might want to share, and this initiated a babble of questions and remarks, which Will explained as a discussion of the shooting at the airport, which tabloids reported as being committed by players of Samhain. Will told Joe in a whisper that the girl named Skyla was referring to their last meeting when they discussed the hidden influence of the game. The girl at her side, named Wilhelmina, her sister, was adding that in the days before they had quit playing 5 months previous, they would find themselves awakening as if from a trance in certain parts of the city with no memory of their journey. They had recovered lucidity in De Wallen, which Will informed Cho was a large red light district. The two girls had found themselves crouched in an alley with kitchen knives tucked into their jackets as if preparing to spring on a group of 3 tourists. Skyla, a small girl with long dark hair and shining dark eyes, was insisting that they had been still mentally in the game and on the verge of committing assault, if not murder. A man named Emmerich, who appeared old enough to be the two girls' father, was adding that authorities were baffled as to how the group had gotten weapons past security. He commented that there were those conspiracy theorists who were suggesting that the game was actually some terrorist mind control plot. It was then that he mentioned Angel Love, and immediately Cho was locked in on the conversation. Emmerich was explaining that Angel Love had more than once mentioned the game in her postings over the last year, and there were those who suspected that it might have led to her murder. Will translated. She had been warning people about the game for months. She urged people to remember that this was not a product sponsored and sold by any commercial retailer, but was the device of an underground network of hackers whose motives were mysterious at best. She was adamant that the recipe for the cocktail was beyond anything concocted by any street dealer. She even referenced the experiments by the secret MK Ultra department in the United States in the 60s with LSD as a mind control substance. I believe she was definitely on something. But I guess now we will never really know. The government, though, sees only another online game. And here we are in Holland, where the game is legal. Excuse me, Joe said, loudly interrupting and drawing the full attention of everyone in the room. He nudged Will and indicated that he should translate. Does our guests have anything he would like to say? Father Christoph said kindly as all eyes fell on Joe. So, are all of you familiar with Angelica Love? He asked as he stood and approached the circle. His question was answered by numerous nods. Do any of you recognize me? He looked at Emmerich, who was studying him intently with a puzzled expression before responding in English. Yes, you look familiar. I have seen you in pictures with Angel Love, have I not? Yes. I worked for her as a security agent. And what brings you to our little group then, sir? Father Christophorus said with polite interest. I admit that I was ignorant that groups like this existed. But now that I hear the things of which you are talking about, and I feel compelled to tell you, you are right. I can tell you firsthand that these theories and experiences which you are discussing are not mere speculation. I am here in Amsterdam for the sole purpose of pursuing the origin of the Samhain game. Meneer, if you can tell us anything about who's running the game, then I would say that you have a captive audience. Father Christophorus waved his hand to show that Joe had the floor. I will begin then by stating that if you do not believe in psychic abilities and the supernatural, then you will have a very hard time believing my story. The interior of Nuppelslang Club Servant had changed little in appearance from its days as a large storage warehouse in pre-World War II era when it had been used for textile distribution. Due to its location, huddled by the Amsterdam Central Railway, it had been confiscated and used by insurgent Nazis as a loading point for the city's Jewish population as they were collected and carried to concentration camps in the 1940s. After the war, government planning had ensured that the massive brick building would be leveled in the name of progress and development. But the protest of the city's historical societies had saved the structure from demolition, with the promise of preserving it as a reminder of the horrors of the Third Reich. However, as other more needful designs drew the city planners' attention, it remained an empty and sullen shell until the 60s. It was then that a small group of hippies took up residence, and the vacancy was filled with a growing commune of flower children until tragedy once again struck. In 1969, the 24 squatters were found dead of an apparent group suicide. After a week-long LSD binge, the 6 men, 10 girls, and 8 children ingested lethal doses of cyanide mixed in red wine. Acquaintances of the group reported that they had become convinced that the world was coming to an end and had sought to escape the foreseen nightmare before they were murdered by a coming pack of demonic zombies. Once more, the building was left abandoned and acquired a reputation amongst the locals as being a cursed and haunted place. In 2004, the warehouse was purchased and renovated by a mysterious foreigner who, within a year, opened a techno dance club ominously called Nuppelslang. The name of the club was taken as a joke in bad taste, referring the delusions of the suicidal commune. The club soon acquired a reputation as being an exclusive spot for the dangerous criminal underground and disillusioned youth of the city. Unbeknownst to the rest of the world, it would also be the birthplace of Samhain online video gaming. Andrew gazed around the room, staring at the dozens of disenfranchised patrons of his club with more than a little humor and disgust. The seemingly endless thud of repetitive drum beats pounded in time with the sickly glow of green strobe lights flashing through the smoke-filled air as clubgoers sat slumped in front of computer monitors and laptops, their eyes shining and fixated on the screens. Here were the Samhain elite, playing as monsters against the world population, twisting and manipulating the minds of others no different than themselves. Here were the musicians in his orchestra of mental deterioration and destruction. And he was the maestro, sitting on a long couch on a center stage, observing his silent attack on the world. The bar was a chemistry lab with beakers filled with red liquid as the ingredients of the cocktail were mixed and liquefied for consumption by the patrons. In the States, the recipe was concocted in bathrooms and basements, but here, a pure and powerful mixture was brewed for all to see. Standing, he made his way across the room, observing various scenes of horror and bloodshed on each monitor with twisted pleasure. If only they knew that soon such scenes would become a shocking and deadly reality. He climbed the metal stairs to the second level, where he walked warily to the door of his private chambers. He typed in the security code and listened as the door unbolted before turning the latch and entering. He paused in the doorway as he became aware that someone was in his rooms. Andrew entered and closed the door quietly behind him, as if automatically sealed itself. He flicked on the lights to see a bald Asian standing behind the chair of his computer module. He immediately recognized him as the 3-Minute Man, whom Peter Agrand had warned him of. Cho Fan Yun. To what do I owe the pleasure of this visit? He said, as he poured a glass of wine and, taking a sip, seated himself on the black leather couch that sat in the middle of the room, adjacent to the large glass walls of the aquarium. I wanted to meet you, Cho said, turning to face his adversary with the large, sparkling golden eyes of a cat. Really? How pleasant. I don't have guests very often. However did you get in? Oh, I've been here most of the evening. I've been watching you. I'm flattered. But I fear you must have been bored. Quite the contrary. I found my observations very interesting. I've come to talk to you. Well, and feel free to speak. I wondered if I would receive a visit from a member of your group. I was fascinated that you disappeared from the airport. But I see that you have acquired some new abilities. I am not here to discuss myself. I want to talk to you about your plan. And what, pray tell, do you know of my plan? Only that you may well destroy the world if you continue to carry on with it. There are many worlds, Mr. Yoon. Losing just this one will hardly make a difference. You say that there are many worlds, but how do you know? Surely your own experiences have proven to you that there is much more than one world, one sphere. You speak of the Book of the Skull, but of course, it more than explains it all, does it not? Then you believe what it says. Why, yes. It is one of the most informative frauds ever capitulated. A fraud, Cho said, stepping forward as uneasy fear began to sink into the pit of his stomach. Andrew looked mildly amused as he took another sip from his glass and studied Cho inquisitively. Mr. Yoon, I have spent decades researching the existence of such things as this book, and I can tell you, beyond a shadow of a doubt, that its origins are quite false. I have traveled to Russia and spoken with the last members of the Maskatov family line. I have seen documents reveal the true design behind the book's creation. And what is that truth? The book was a hoax created by Madame Arkhip Zolkin and Afanasy Maskatov. Both powerful mediums, mind you. But the book was in no way dictated by the remains of a dead Russian. But there are letters, oh yes, fraudulent letters, sent and conveniently lost to the public to further substantiate the mythology of the book. Unfortunately, their little hoaxes backfired. Afanasy and Arkhip were lovers who saw themselves as the messiahs of a new religion which would consolidate all religions, spiritualities, and the occult into one world belief. The only true letter is the one lost letter, the last letter, where Arkhip confesses her madness and claims to have actually been contacted by the skull. That can't be true, Cho said, stifling the confusion which was building as he thought of Angel and everything she had said. Mr. Yoon, I found this information in the course of researching the origins of my family. Somehow, in her madness, Zolkin uncovered the ritual to be carried out which would eventually bring about my existence in this foul world. But this information was revealed during some hallucination induced by the final stages of syphilis. She was a very naughty girl. The fraud, however, was convincing enough that the book was reviled as a thing of black magic and evil. Instead of being the Bible of their new faith, it was collected, destroyed, and buried by the powers that be. But I know of those who have seen the skull. Angel saw the skull. Now, that is interesting. Mass hypnosis, perhaps? Even psychics can be prey to the powers of suggestion. You are a liar, Joe shouted as he leapt forward only to find himself locked in place. He glanced down in surprise, only to find himself standing in the middle of a circle drawn in the floor in blood. Oh, I see you have noticed the containment circle. One of those little tricks my friend Mr. Levine could have made use of. Andrew stood from the couch with lethargic ease and, opening the drawer of an end table, withdrew a .44 caliber revolver from within. All this Cho watched and heard 3 minutes in advance from where he stood before his last step into the circle. Cho's own gun was drawn and aimed at Andrew where he sat on the couch. Andrew stared at him coldly, a hideous, contemptuous smile slowly spreading across his face. I'm not drugged tonight, Cho said as he pulled the trigger. He watched as the image of Andrew disappeared like a shadow in sunlight, and the bullets ripped into the cushions of the sofa. A trick by a master of deceptions. Now Cho's precognition showed the sorcerer behind him approaching, and spinning he fired again at the form approaching from the shadows at the back of the room. He heard laughing as this illusion too faded. The future echo continued, and to his horror, he heard a soft female voice from his side, and turning, was confronted with the bloodied and beaten corpse of Angelica, reaching out with one cold hand. "You have to let me help you, Cho," she said with urgency. And for a moment his mind was wiped clean, and all that existed were her soft green eyes imploring him. That was when he felt the needle in his back. The specter of Angel faded as he fell backwards into the floor, with Andrew Love standing beside him. The man leaned down as his white shirt, unbuttoned at the chest, fell to open to reveal the hundreds of phrases inscribed on his flesh. "I knew you were here all night, Mr. Yoon. I see into the in-between quite well. There are poisons that work even on those like you, at least well enough to incapacitate you for a time." Cho heard the sorcerer's laugh as he lifted Cho's paralyzed arms and dragged him across the floor to the enormous glass room. "And believe me, my friend, what is in there will destroy you with ease." Cho heard the typing of the passcode and unlocking of the door. He was dragged inside and left slump against the glass as Andrew once more sealed the portal. Cho smelled the dank, foul air within and knew he was in the presence of something with rotted, corrupt flesh. The floor of the massive structure held 6 inches of putrid water, and behind a facsimile of rocks was a false cave, from which he saw 2 green lights appear side by side in the darkness. "Look, Mr. Yoon, and see the future," Andrew said through an intercom, which projected his mocking voice into the tank. "Whose future?" Cho whispered just loudly enough for the sorcerer to hear. "The future that would have been mine, but now will be delegated to the masses of the world in my stead. Are you familiar with Norse mythology? Have you ever heard of the Midgard serpent, one of Loki's children? Jormungand encircled the world like a giant wheel and devoured its own tail. It is a very important symbol in alchemy, for he represents eternity and immortality. At the end of the world, Ragnarok, he will be free to poison the world. I am Jormungand, Mr. Yoon. My line has existed trapped in these bodies for much too long, and the energy of our true selves can only erode this physiology until all that is left is what you see before you. This energy must be disseminated before the original host may be purified." The thing which crawled towards Cho was an enormous, decayed mass of rotted flesh and jutting exposed bone stretched and shaped into the likeness of some reptile. The visage which gazed at him was a twisted half-human skull to which shreds of flesh hung loose to exposed gray muscle tissue beneath. The long forked tongue tasted the air through a mouth set with long dripping fangs. "There are other wheels," Cho whispered, as much to himself as to his captor. "For example, there is a wheel of fortune. It is said that one who finds himself at one position on that wheel may well trade places with another in a single turn." "Forgive me, Mr. Yoon, but I have no fear of trading places with you at this time," Andrew replied, laughing. "Oh, but the wheel has not yet made a full turn, Mr. Love." Cho looked up at Andrew with his strange golden eyes and smiled, before his body began to fade and blow in wisps of black smoke. As the sorcerer watched, Cho vanished into emptiness as the monstrosity clawed at the spot where he had lain in confusion. Andrew concentrated and stared into the in-between, but could find no remnant of the poisoned psychic.